you get a temperature rise. As a consequence of that, Arctic sea ice melts, and therefore, well, there's less reflection from the white ice and more absorptions of the sun rays, the heat, into the dark oceans, which causes a temperature rise. Arctic sea ice melts, you get less reflection, more absorption, and so on. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise. You get forest dieback. In other words, the forests just die. As a consequence of that, there's less CO2 being absorbed because there's less trees to absorb that CO2. That's what trees do. They absorb CO2. So you get a temperature rise. You get more forest dieback. You get less CO2 absorbed. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise and you get forest fires. As the forests dry out, they catch fire. This, by the way, is a picture of the Amazon. So you get forest fires, which means now you've got less CO2 absorbed because there are less trees to absorb that CO2. And in fact, more CO2 is being released because those trees are on fire and sending the CO2 up, which means that you get more of a temperature rise, more forest fires, less CO2 absorbed, more CO2 released. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise. And you get more water vapor in the atmosphere. Now, the thing is, water vapor absorbs heat because it is a greenhouse gas. It stops the heat going out into space. So now you get a temperature rise, more water vapor in the atmosphere, water vapor absorbs heat, and so on. Oh, and here's another one. You get a temperature rise. Arctic permafrost melts. Therefore, CO2 is released, but also methane is released. And methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. So you get a temperature rise, Arctic permafrost melts, more CO2, methane is released, and there's gigatons of that stuff, methane, in the permafrost. Oh, here's another one. You get a temperature rise and you get more use of fans and air conditioners. It sounds a little bit trite, doesn't it? Well, guess what? More energy consumption. And that energy consumption is inevitably more fossil fuels, so you get more of a temperature rise, more use of fans and air conditioners, more energy consumption, and so on. Oh yeah, and all those feedback loops can work together. They're not in isolation. So perhaps then we, as a global community, should work together to do something about it, should be cooperating to do something about it. But in a changing world with more climatic pressures, with less resources, maybe you're not going to get cooperation. Maybe what you're going to get actually is competition between countries. Maybe actually you're going to get a move towards popularism, a move towards nationalism. Maybe there's going to be tensions between countries. Maybe there's going to be conflict between countries. Maybe in fact there's going to be war between countries. Certainly the IPCC say if we carry on business as usual, in other words, do nothing, risks include high levels of public unrest and political destabilization due to the increasing climatic pressures resulting in some countries becoming dysfunctional. Or which means that this place here, the United Nations, well, maybe that becomes the disunited nations. And that's a feedback loop too, by the way. We get a temperature rise, which means we get more populism, nationalism, tensions, conflict, war, which means, well, there's more competition between nations now, less collaboration, so you get a temperature rise, more populism, nationalism, tensions, conflict, war, more competition, less collaboration, and so on. And whilst that's happening, the temperature keeps on going up, and it moves us ever closer to tipping points.